Hi guys, in this video I'm going to tell you about weak forms, what are weak forms, what are contracted forms, weak forms, what are the rules to distinguish between weak and strong forms, and of course I'm going to give you examples to help you understand these rules. Now remember, in the English language, a small set of very common words, that is highly frequent monosyllabic function words, they have an alternative way of being pronounced. That is, they are reduced to a simplified form for the ease of pronunciation. These forms are weak forms, and weak forms are normally used in connected speech. The strong forms are reserved for emphasis. Let's have a look at this example. We said that history was our favorite subject. You can see the words that, was, and are. They all are expressed using weak forms. Weak forms, remember, are not sloppy, so they are part of fluent pronunciation. In the example above, the words that, was, and are, these are unemphasized, yet they're very frequent words. In the case of that and was, you can see that the original vowel reduces to a schwa, but that's not the only thing that leads to a weak form. Weak forms can also mean a loss of the H phoneme, the H phoneme, as in his, he, him. Weak forms also occur in many of the word classes like determiners, conjunctions, prepositions, verbs, and pronouns. So which word classes get weak forms? Let's have a look at these functional classes like determiners. They are words used to modify or introduce a noun in a sentence, and these include articles, adjectives of quantity, demonstrative adjectives, possessive adjectives. Examples: a, an, the, some, his, her, are, your. Conjunctions are words that connect words, phrases, and clauses like and, but, as, than, and that. Prepositions are words used before a noun, a pronoun, a noun phrase to show direction, time, place, location, spatial relationships, or to introduce a subject. An object, sorry. For example, at, for, from, often to. The inflections of the verb to be, like am, are, is, was, and were. Auxiliary verbs, which are helping verbs because they help to complete the meaning of main verbs, like has, have, and had. Modal auxiliaries also function as helping verbs that are used to express ability, possibility, permission, or obligation, like can, could, will, would, shall, should, and must. And pronouns are words used instead of nouns. For example, them, he, him, her, and you. So all these functional classes, highly frequent words here, they have weak forms. Contracted forms, they are weak forms. They are reduced in pronunciation in fluent speech, and they are like weak forms. The only difference is that you see it in the spelling, like I'm, your, he's, he'd, we've, they'll, can't, and don't. So they're all contracted forms are weak forms. Remember that. Let's have a look at the general rules. Now remember that words that can have a weak form are always pronounced using the weak form in fluent speech. So that's easy. But there are three exceptions. If the word is at the end of a sentence, you use the strong form. There's an exception for pronouns here. I'll come to that later. If the word is emphasized, you use the strong form. If the word is used on its own, you use the strong form. The exception to the first rule is that pronouns, they keep their weak form even at the end of a sentence. So I haven't seen him. So you can see that we don't say I haven't seen him. You say I haven't seen him. Him. So you see that pronouns, they keep their weak forms even at the end of a sentence. Let's have a look at some specific rules. Modal auxiliaries: will, would, can, could, shall, should, and must. You can see the strong forms phonetically transcribed here, and also the weak forms. The weak forms, as usual, are most common, but there are exceptions. Remember, weak forms are not possible when the modal is the only verb in its clause, like I would if I could. In this case, you will use the strong form. Or if the modal is before a pause, such as at the end of the phrase or a sentence, even in this case, you are going to use the strong form. If you have a look at this sentence, I would think that this should be enough. You can see that we are using the weak form in both cases, because in both, in these examples, you can see that there is an additional verb, think, and be. And also, this means that obviously the modals are not the final words in their respective clauses. So you use the weak forms. There are other auxiliaries like have, has, and had. You can see the strong forms and the weak forms. There is a little note about the H here in the weak forms. Remember that the H cannot be deleted. I'm talking about this one. Cannot be deleted when preceded by a pause, such as the beginning of a sentence. So if you have, has, or had at the beginning of a sentence, you will see that the H cannot be deleted there. So weak forms are not possible when the same rules apply as that for modals. So you can check back in modals if the auxiliary is the only one in its clause, or if it's before a pause, such as at the end of a phrase or sentence. There's one important thing. This is really important, that have is a content verb when it shows obligation. So have will not be pronounced in its weak form if it's a content verb. Let's have a look at these examples. Have you taken your medicines? You have to follow your doctor's instructions. Now, you have to is an obligation, so you're going to use the strong form with the F. All right, so that's one thing that you have to remember. It's not the V, it's the F. So, yeah, and I already have, then you can use, I already have. You can use the strong form because it's at the end of a sentence. So this is important. So when have is a content verb, when it shows obligation, you use the strong form. The same rules apply when you use the present forms of the verb to do, like do and does, and when they function as auxiliaries, when they function as helping verbs. So what do you want to do, and why does it matter? So you can see at the end of a sentence, do you use in the strong form, otherwise you just use their weak forms. Then to be. Be can also be a helping verb, an auxiliary, and the inflections of the verb to be, am, are, is, was, and were that have weak forms can still be used even when there is no other verb in the clause. So this is a little bit of an exception when you compare it to modals. And an exception to this exception is that it doesn't apply for contractions like wasn't or isn't. So you can see these verbs am, was, are, and were in their strong forms and the weak forms. Let's have a look at an example. He was in the same situation as I was. So you can see that the first was is in its weak form, and the second one is because it's at the end of a phrase or of the sentence, you use the strong form. Prepositions. So you use the strong form of these if these are at the end of a clause or a sentence. You can also see there's a little bit of a note for of, so it's reduced to a schwa before the, and for to, before a vowel you take the it's not reduced to a schwa but to the short u. So have a look at this. So you'll see that's in its weak form. And where are they coming from? So it's because it's at the end of a clause or a sentence, you are going to use the strong form. Personal pronouns, that is the weak forms of personal pronouns, they can be used before pauses at the ends of clauses or sentences. We already discussed this, that pronouns are the exceptions to the first general rule. So you can see these personal pronouns, he, him, her, them, us, and you, the strong forms and the weak forms. In the first two cases, the he and the him, remember they are not used if you find he and him at the beginning of a sentence. So let's have a look at this example. He wants her to come home with him. So he, since it's at the beginning of a sentence, you're going to use the strong form. All right, her, of course, you'll use the weak form. And come home with him. Remember, normally you would use the strong form, but because this is a pronoun this is an exception to the rule, pronouns even at the end of a sentence or a clause are used in their weak forms. Possessive determiners like his, her, are, and your. So the same rules apply. So her brother is our new boss. Remember, if it's preceded by a pause, that if it's his or hers used at the beginning of a sentence, you use the strong form. Otherwise, you use the weak forms. The other determiners like a and the, some, Remember that, yeah, again, the same thing, the same rule applies if they are at the end of a sentence or a clause. You use the strong form, like, do you want some? I want some more tea, please. So you use the weak form there. Do you also want some? And because it's ending the sentence, you use the strong form. There is a little note about the and the some, so you can take a note of that. Then conjunctions. So you see the strong and the weak forms of conjunctions there. There's an important note for that. The demonstrative that only has a strong form. So when you're using that to demonstrate something, then you use the strong form. Let's have a look at these examples. It seems that his injuries are minor ones. So this is not really demonstrative. You're not really pointing out to something. You use the weak form. And that is all we know for now. In this case, you are going to use the strong form of that, because here that is functioning as a demonstrative conjunction. So these were all the rules, and should there be questions, please let me know. All the best.